Kate Seredy was born in 1899 in Budapest, Hungary, the only child of a schoolteacher and his wife. Nothing else is recorded about her early life until the later years of the First World War, when, having enrolled at the Academy of Arts in Budapest, she left for Paris to work as a combat nurse at the age of only 18. When the war ended a year later, she returned to Hungary, where she stayed until 1922. In that year she left for the USA, where she set about learning English as quickly as she could, while simultaneously trying to find work as an illustrator in New York. She found the going far from easy, but did manage to get commissions to create quite a few line and two-colour illustrations for a series known as the Work Playbooks, which used storytelling with pictures to develop reading skills in children. Although not exactly generously paid, they helped her to keep body and soul together, but they were far from creatively challenging or particularly well suited to her own stylistic inclinations. She did also create some more typical, well-executed monochromes for Andre Norton's adventure story The Prince Commands at this time. But it wasn't until 1935 that Seredy was fortunate enough to meet May Massey, the children's editor at Viking Press. Massey encouraged her to write about her childhood in Hungary, and a few months later Seredy submitted the manuscript and drawings for her story The Good Master. The narrative wasn't actually autobiographical, but she did use her own childhood experiences as the foundation for the story. Specifically, her young female protagonist was sent by her widowed father to live with her uncle and his family in rural Hungary, and the illustrations she produced were both charming and evocative of what to young American readers would have been a highly unexpected and distant geographical location and culture. Although only monochrome, they were tonally rendered with considerable sensitivity, using a combination of watercolour wash and additional graphite shading. The book proved to be both a popular and critical success, and it was the runner-up in that year's Newbery Prize Awards. With a certain irony, it lost out to Carol Ryrie Brink's American frontier story Caddy Woodlawn, which had also been illustrated by Seredy. And on this occasion she created the illustrations using tightly controlled ink stippling to produce tonal effects. This double success as both illustrator and author quickly turned Seredy's fortunes around, and both books were instrumental in her establishing a significant foothold in children's publishing in her adopted country. From this point onwards she had a long run of successes with books she illustrated and quite a few which she also wrote, and it was also in 1935 that she was commissioned to create illustrations for The Selfish Giant and Other Stories, compiled by Wilhelmina Harper. For this book she produced a collection of charming watercolour wash and colour pencil images to accompany each of the tales, although I could unfortunately only find these 3 examples to show. If anything, 1936 was an even more prolific year for Seredy, and among others she had her second authored book, Listening, published. Unfortunately, this is another where usable examples are hard to come by, so these few will just have to suffice. And it's a similar story with a couple of Seredy's other projects from that year. Winterbound by Marjorie Bianco features some tantalising but only sparse examples in both duotone and monochrome pencil. And she produced some similarly grainy sepia printed drawings for Mademoiselle Misfortune, another book written by Carol Ryrie Brink. But undoubtedly the most significant of that year's multiple offerings was The Gunny Wolf and Other Merry Tales, another collection which, like the previous year's Selfish Giant, was compiled and edited by Wilhelmina Harper. Seredy's illustrations for this book were created in full colour, using a highly distinctive and easy on the eye combination of light washes with added tonal shading in colour pencil. And these mostly but not exclusively animal themed images were obviously a major factor in the popular success of the book. By this time her financial fortunes had taken a significant upturn, and she bought a 100-acre farm named Listening Hill near Montgomery, New York. And it was from there that she wrote The White Stag, a retelling of various Hungarian legends which she had been told by her father in childhood. It was tonally rendered and printed in a very dark brown just this side of black and a secondary paler ochre, which lent all the images a suitably traditional character. And although the images were created using what had by now become her expected grainy execution, the subject matter this time around was considerably more dramatic and in some cases significantly darker in mood than any of her earlier offerings. But this undoubtedly greatly enhanced the book's romantic mythical appeal, and it went on to win the 1938 Newbery Award as Best Children's Book. Following the considerable success of The White Stag, she wrote and illustrated another of her own novels, The Singing Tree, which was published in 1939. It was a sequel to her earlier debut, The Good Master, and it dealt with the effects of World War I on the young protagonist and her family. And although, like all her work, it was aimed at children, the story didn't try to whitewash the events of that period of conflict. And this sensitively written narrative was perfectly matched with equally sensitive atmospheric figure-based illustrations. 1939 was also the year that the book An Ear for Uncle Emile, written by Eva Rowe Gagin, was published. The author was American but had spent some time in Switzerland, which was where this charming little story was set. And for this book, Seredy abandoned her usual apparent preference for tonal expression and returned to pure black and white, using a range of stippling and hatching with highly engaging results. In 1941 she published another of her own stories, A Tree for Peter, a wistful but ultimately joyful tale about a lonely boy in a run-down shanty town. The images she created for this book ranged quite freely between character-based and more scenic illustration, and all were suitably emotive, rendered with both precision and expressiveness, and printed in sepia to create a nostalgic mood in all the images. 1943's The Oldest Story, a collection of biblical narratives rewritten by Blanche Jennings Thompson, could not have been more different, and if I hadn't known better I would never have recognised them as Seredy's work. All the illustrations created for this book were line-only and formally composed with a relatively dispassionate and even-handed pen style. Nevertheless, they had their own distinctive qualities and were well suited to the reverential nature of the book's subject matter. But the same year as The Open Gate returned to a more expective and expressive sketchy technique, in this instance apparently created without benefit of conspicuous ink line work, to illuminate her own pleasantly inconsequential and heartwarming story about an urban American family who moved to the countryside to establish a farm and start a new life away from the city. In 1944, The Christmas Anna Angel by Ruth Sawyer was published, and for this commission Seredy was able to return to the application of meaningful colour in her work, and she did so with considerable aesthetic success. This was a particularly attractive collection of colour illustrations, but I'm not convinced they were actually created that way by Seredy. There is something about the flat application of bright primary colours that suggests the colour was actually applied mechanically over her original monochromes. Unfortunately, it's scans of the printed outcomes of her illustrations rather than her original drawings that form the vast majority of what I'm showing in this video, so this has to be pure speculation on my part. And however they were produced, this was manifestly another highlight and commercial success among her many other achievements. In 1946, The Wonderful Year, another determinedly rural story for children by Nancy Barnes, was published, with a collection of deceptively sketchy, highly expressive pen drawings from Seredy, which employed appropriate light humour to illuminate the good-natured, amusing story. The book Adopted Jane, written by Helen Fern Derringer, was published a year later, and it featured identically styled pen drawings of equal expressiveness as the previous year's commission. And both of these little departures into energetic pen renders were an indication of her own creative restlessness in her choice and application of mediums. In 1948, her next authored book, The Chestry Oak, was published. This story concerned a young Hungarian prince and his life during the Nazi occupation of his country during World War II. But despite not being the jolliest of premises for a children's story, Seredy handled both the written and drawn elements with a finely trodden line between sober reflection and romantic entertainment. There followed an uncharacteristic gap of 3 years before her next published work. Gypsy was her own story of a cat, and it featured unsentimental but endearing, particularly grainy monochromes of a cat and her kittens, with little reference to the rest of the world. And even without any perceived need to anthropomorphise her feline characters, there was no shortage of emotional appeal. It was also in 1951 that she provided illustrations for Little Vic by Doris Gates, a horse-themed narrative for which she created simple but expressive pen and ink drawings, which were entirely character-based, to chart the horse's life from birth to race winner. By this time Seredy was definitely slowing down her previously formidable output, and it was 1955 before her next book appeared. But Philomena, the story of a young girl living in the Czech capital Prague, was well worth the wait. Despite being only reproduced as tonal black and white, Sheredy's textured renders and the variety of illustrative approaches featured, these images made for a collection of diverse and absorbing evocations of the place, time and characters. The Tenement Tree was another of her unwritten works, published 4 years later in 1959, and it was a heartfelt and significantly early plea for the conservation of the natural world, and arguably one of her greatest achievements. She produced a collection of densely rendered, dark and grainy monochromes, which were uniformly possessed of considerable solidity. These illustrations sharply contrasted the threatening images of industrial pollution with depictions of animal life to be found in the wooded areas being laid waste to in the name of progress. The animals and their habitat were as faithful to reality as any wildlife artist might create, and again there was no hint of anthropomorphism present in the creatures. And without resorting to overt propaganda or sentimentality, Seredy instead eloquently made her point that such destruction was in nobody's interest. In 1961 she published another of her own stories, A Brand New Uncle. This was another very domestic and ultimately heartwarming American story about an elderly couple who retired to the countryside. And in this instance she largely confined herself to character-based compositions. Looking back over much of her work, it seems to me that she was sometimes working from observation and at other times probably not. But in this instance, although betting isn't among my vices, I would be fairly confident in asserting she was drawing from life, or at least photographic sources. In 1962 she created this poster promoting the spread of literacy in young Americans, and in the same year she published her last book. This was the story of Lazy Tinker, a little girl who envies the supposedly work-free existence of animals, but finds out their lives aren't leisurely at all, and of course learns a valuable life lesson in the process. However transparently moralistic the narrative may have been, the book contains a collection of mostly colour illustrations, featuring the exploits of her charming if wayward little protagonist. And in this case I'm fairly confident that the colour was actually applied by Seredy, as it is manifestly textural in its application. But following the publication of this final creative and commercial success, Kate Seredy retired, and she died in 1975 in Middletown, New York, at the age of 75. Despite her equal prowess as an author, Seredy herself apparently considered the writing of her books just an excuse for making pictures, which indicates a level of modesty not found in many who could boast such popular success, especially in a language other than their own. I have no idea, but I'm sure quite a few of my mature American viewers will tell me how popular or well known her work remains. But in Britain, and I suspect much of Western Europe, her work is largely unknown by most. Like others I've covered, Seredy seems to have put her own creative objectives at the top of her priorities, rather than seeking out the line of least resistance to commercial success. As such, her work is not only distinctive but restless in its pursuit of excellence in a range of techniques and use of mediums. And it may well have been good luck that she fell in with May Massey and the consequent turnaround in her fortunes, but it was a lucky break that was richly deserved.